1091, I'm on scene. I'll be assuming Caroline Street Command. I got a 2.5-story wood occupied multiple dwelling. I got heavy fire from the second floor, Charlie side. I have an exposure on the Delta side. We have one line stretch not in operation yet. Primary searches are underway. Status of the fire is doubtful. One passing command. I'm on the first line. Speed advisor on scene. 2-story wood frame. I got heavy fire from the Alpha side.
Greetings, welcome back, Volley Chief fans. This is Chief Lenart, and we're going to be on episode 2 of our special River Restaurant series. I want to thank everyone. We got a lot of tremendous feedback on the first episode, a lot of good buzz, a very nice reflection of the event. So we're going to continue today with the second part of our series, and we're going to start talking to some of the actual responders that were there. So for the first responder to talk to today is one of the first people on scene. I'm going to throw the asterisk out there right now that this could be a hostile interview, you know. So one of the first people on scene, our ambulance and Derby at the time. Again, let me give you the backup too of the explanation that our ambulance corps is separate from the fire department, and the ambulance corps provides rescue services for the city. However, the overwhelming majority of the membership belong to both organizations. So the fire company is the Storm Engine Company, number 2, and the ambulance corps is the Storm Engine Company ambulance corps. So we like to do that just to confuse everybody, but we interchange them a lot because most of the members belong to both organizations. So they were on a medical, transported to Griffin Hospital. Derby, again, very small, 5 square miles. We have a small community hospital, Griffin Hospital. It's about 160-bed acute care facility, and the ambulance was returning from a call when the call came in. On the crew, obviously, at that time was my father, Tom Lenart Sr. At that point, he had been in the fire department since 1975, and again, so he's been in the department for a decade. He was assistant chief of the ambulance corps at the time, still a firefighter with the fire department. And then one of the unique parts of my father's story is he had to switch roles, and obviously we're going to talk about that because he was also a sergeant in the police department at the time. So I'm going to let my father introduce himself, give you a little bit of background on him and his experience, and then we'll get into the incident. So, Dad, you're up.
Hello, everyone. Tom Lenart Sr. Little background, as Dave said, I was been in the fire department since 1975, going through all the officers' chairs. Also a police officer since 1976, and an EMT since 1974. So I've had a little emergency services experience. So I was, as David said, we were returning from a call when we got the call of the River Restaurant. I was with a gentleman by the name of Clarence Douglas. Doug was part of the Greatest Generation, and he was our driver.
I'll give you a quick background on Doug just to give you kind of the experience that he had. Doug was a intelligence officer during World War II who landed on D-Day and fought in all 5 of the major land battles in the European theater during World War II. And just a well-respected, he worked for the phone company, ran our fire alarm system, but a lot of people in the Valley knew Doug very well, and he was very well respected. He was, not to get off topic, but he was given a very high award, the Legion of Honor, by the French government before his passing. So a lot of people in our area remember Doug and know him. But what do you remember, Dad? What did it come in as?
It came in as an explosion, and I remember saying to Doug, we were turning from the hospital onto Seymour Avenue, which basically overlooks Main Street. And I remember saying to him, even though it was coming in as an explosion, we said it was probably, Doug said to me, it was probably a pot on the stove. And as we were looking at the area where Main Street was, there was this very, very funny haze hanging over the area. And I remember Doug turning to me and saying, we better get the rescue truck. I've seen a lot of buildings blown up during the war, and all I know is that haze means something bad. So we set out to head to the call. We stopped, got the rescue truck, and then responded to the scene.
Which, again, Derby being a very small community, it wasn't a big detour. To get from the hospital on Seymour Avenue to downtown where the incident was, you really had to go behind the firehouse. You were one block off on Elizabeth Street, so it wasn't a big detour. So did you drove in on the ambulance or the rescue truck?
On the rescue truck. Doug took the ambulance ahead of me.
And then when you got there, like when did you realize like it was that bad?
As soon as we pulled up, the front of the building, what was the front, was literally blown across the street into the buildings on the other side of the street. The building was leaning. It looked like almost, the best way to describe it is like an A-frame. The floors had pancake down, but there were openings in the front of the building from where the front literally blew across the street.
So obviously the type of collapse was more of a pancake, which we know is not as good for victims as like an A-frame collapse in the emergency services. There's two types of building collapse, like a lean-to or a pancake, and this was where basically the force of the explosion caused the floors to come down like a stack of pancakes on top of each other.
So seeing that and knowing the building and knowing the restaurant, we knew that there had to be a lot of people in that building. And the thought was, let's get in there and see who we can get out. And the building was on fire. The back of the building looked like it had collapsed. And I remember going into the building, and one of the first people I saw was the owner, Alfonso Ippolino Sr. And he was covered in blood. And I remember taking him out of the building and getting him out, even though he vehemently protested he was not coming out of that building until he knew where everybody was. So we pulled him out, and I remember going back into the building and seeing one of my other police officers who also volunteered with the ambulance as an EMT, Andy Coda. And we went back into the building, and the strangest thing happened. Out of a pile of rubble, I saw somebody's hand come up. It looked like something out of a horror movie. And I looked, and there was a lady just under all of the rubble and the tables and the chairs. I pulled her out with Andy. We got her out to the sidewalk and out to the street. And we were going back in. We got about maybe 15, 20 feet into the building, and you could feel the floor starting to shift a little bit. Andy said to me, he said, we better get out of here. He said, we're going to be wearing this building in a few minutes. So that was when we kind of gave up trying to do any kind of a rescue from the front of the building.
Now, as our technology grows here on the Volley Chief, so there's a picture, and I know that we've talked about some pictures before, which is obviously a terrible thing to do on a podcast, but there's a picture of you and Andy talking out in front of the building. Was that, do you remember like when that was? Was that before you guys went in? Was that after you guys came out? It seemed like pretty early in the incident because that front facade was still standing. It hadn't collapsed yet.
That was actually right after we came out of the building. We were both trying to assess what the next move was going to be. And one of the things we were trying to figure out is how do we know how many people were in this place and where they were? And that was one of the biggest concerns right then. It was a popular restaurant, and on a Friday afternoon, you were lucky.
Christmas time?
It was Christmas time, and you were lucky if you got a seat when you came there, if you didn't have to wait for an hour or two, because that's how popular the restaurant was. It was a local family. The Ippolitos had been known for years and years and years throughout the valley, so it was not something that you would expect wouldn't have people inside. And our biggest concern was how many, where are they, and how do we account for them?
Right, and then at what point, after that, after you and Andy, Chief Coda, because he went on to be police chief, so I'll probably refer to him as Chief Coda. At what point did you and Chief Coda, after that, what did you guys do next?
Next thing was basically trying to grab Mr. Ippolito and get an accounting from him of who was there and what they were doing and where in the building they should have been. He was very good. He was, for somebody who had been in the building when it exploded, he was shaken, but he still could think critically. And he was telling us where the cooks and the staff should be. He was telling us who was in the building and who was at the bar at the time. And fortunately, he told us that he was expecting 200 people for a Christmas party that night, an hour later, but they hadn't started arriving yet. So we had some idea of about a dozen people that were inside. There were also people out on the street. Again, back then, there were other businesses. It was a pretty vibrant business area, and there were people on the street that were injured. So we started to take an accounting of them. We were calling for more resources. I remember making one call to CMed New Haven asking for 20 ambulances. And the response I got was, we'll find them. Let us know what else you need. And with that, I remembered the director, John Gustafson, asking me if I wanted help from New Haven. And lo and behold, some of the New Haven firefighters, including Chief Grant, responded to the building.
Chief Seward, Billy Seward,
Yep.
you know, good friend of ours here in Derby, along with Chief Grant. You know, there's a very close relationship between the Derby and the New Haven fire departments, and it's kind of an oddity between a big city fire department and a small town volunteer department. And it's existed for a very long time, and they've always been. If you look historically, when there was something big happening in the valley, you know, we got use the local term in New Haven, the school would dump and come to help the valley. I mean, even, you know, as recently as the large-scale latex foam fire, you know, a lot of resources, Chief Grant, you know, came up and assisted with running that. So it's those great relationships that you have that's one of the things that made this work even back then. And just for background too, for the CMed system, that's our ambulance mutual aid. Its primary purpose was to establish hospital to ambulance communications, but they also handled ambulance mutual aid. So when you would get a medical call, you'd sign on with the fire department saying you were going, and then you'd let CMed know you were going. If you needed a paramedic, if you needed to speak to the doctor, or if you had an accident, you needed more ambulances, you went through CMed. So back then, the dispatching in Derby was a single cop on the desk at the Derby police station, who was Artie Fredericks, who was also another well-known member of the Storms. And he would say that, you know, thank God for CMed, because he couldn't get a phone call out of the police station because so many people were calling in. So CMed played a very vital part in coordinating the EMS and the medical response to this. So what next?
So after that, we began to assess how many people there were. We asked that the local hospital, Griffin Hospital, implement the disaster plan that they had, so they could start bringing in resources for trauma victims. We started treating some of the victims out in front, and we became aware that they were in contact with someone in the back of the building who was trapped under the rubble. They could hear him talking, and so that pretty much launched another type of a search, and that was trying to find a way into where he was and how to get him out of there.
And that would have been the owner's son, Michael Ippolito. He correct?
Yes.
Okay, so he was trapped, and that's kind of you know, going to be a central focus because, you know, for the time and the equipment and the knowledge, it was it's going to be a tremendous undertaking to get to him.
The incident also was ultimately sparked by a gas leak, and as we were working, they were determining that there were gas pockets all in the area. We had to evacuate some of the other buildings. We also had to move some of the rescue equipment back away from the building, and again, this is all happening at once. So we're trying to coordinate medical, we're trying to coordinate rescue services, and there's still a fire in the building. So it just was an undertaking that no one really could have ever prepared for.
And again, back then, gas meters weren't a dime a dozen like they are nowadays, correct?
Correct. Hardly anybody had one other than the gas company.
Okay. Did we have one back then? Do you know?
We did have one, and we put it to good use, and that was immediately taken off the scale.
Right.
And that prompted some of the evacuations. And I remember, as much as you don't want to see them, there were a lot of spectators that were drawn to it, and we had to move those people back several blocks from the area because there was a danger of gas pockets filling into the sewers and causing more explosions.
Now, the rescue of Michael Ippolito took two avenues, right? There were two attempts to effect the rescue. One was basically top down from the pile, and one was coming in next door from what was the Artisan Press at the time building. So, am I correct?
Yes.
In understanding?
Yes.
So now, explain like where you went from there.
From there, I went to the back of the building, saw one of my other assistant chiefs from the ambulance corps, Pat Lahaza, and Chief Grant. And so we found our way into the basement of the adjacent building. And it was the area Michael was in, was pretty much against the wall of the adjacent building. But it was a brick wall that we had to get through. And it was tricky because the structures were still shifting and settling. So we began trying to pull bricks out of that area, pull them out of the wall, and we could hear guys talking to Michael and trying to get a better sense of how close we were and where we were. We were there a good 10-15 minutes. We had gotten almost completely through the wall when the building we were in started to shift and lean. And that was when Chief Grant said, "Okay, guys, time to get out of here because this isn't going to stand up much more." And especially with people digging from different areas, you didn't know what was going to be the weak area to fall in next. So with that, we withdrew from the building and basically centered all the rescue efforts on coming in from the rear of the building and going top down. The good thing was there was heavy equipment there that we actually got some of the volunteers to run from a construction site so that we could start moving debris faster and more.
Now, at this point, Dad, were you like aware of like who was in the building, right? So we talked last week about, Mrs. Pogazowski and the fact that her son was a member of the Storms, and were you guys aware at that point that that members of the fire department's family were the victims that you were looking for?
We found that out, I'd say about an hour into the rescue. We found out, again, from talking to other people who were in the building or who were associated with the restaurant, who should have been there and who would have been there. And we knew there were approximately 6 people that we didn't hear from. What we were hearing was that they were in voice communication with one person on the east side of the building, and then they thought they heard another person on the southwest side of the building. So there were only 2 people that we were talking to. We did find out that there were, and again, because the valley's so small, there were members of our own company whose family was in there working at the time. Ultimately, we had found out they were deceased.
And last week we sat down with Pete Pogazowski, the son of Connie, and again, a longtime member of the Storm Engine Company. And I explained to him that I was doing the podcast and that we were going to be talking about the explosion. And I'll tell you, he gave me some of the best source material, some of the best information, and I really appreciate that, especially coming from his obviously involvement in it, and it's just another layer of the story. And speaking of other layers, at what point did you have to I hate to say turn your spidey sense on, but what point did you start switching into what I would call like cop mode? Because the city of Derby's not very large, and the police department's only about 30 officers. So at what point did you have to pull back and assume your full-time job?
Well, it was probably, I'd say, about 2.5 hours into the incident. Actually, Detective Sergeant Fredericks at the time, said to me, "Go home, put your uniform on. You're coming back here to work. We got to start dealing with crowd control, and we got to figure out where we're going to go from here. We got to start trying to preserve whatever evidence there could be." So at that point in time, I kind of had to disconnect from the ambulance and the rescue mode and go into the police officer mode. So that became the focus. And with that, we were trying to find a place to land a helicopter. Lifestar was called. We were also trying to deal with the media. The media crush from this event was just immense. So having 30 officers and only having 6 on a shift made it very difficult to pretty much call for all hands. For the biggest problem was Route 34 and this incident is very close to Route 8. It's a key intersection in the town of Derby, and it's a key intersection for the state of Connecticut. Traffic was at a virtual standstill. On a Friday night, that road is traffic mess to begin with, and now trying to get people in or out of that area, trying to get resources in and out of that area became almost impossible because you had to just literally fight your way through the traffic. So at that point in time is when I switched from one mode into the other.
And did you come home and change?
Yes,
I remember that. Like
I
things,
did.
I do. I remember Dad ran in the house and changed and ran back out the door. So obviously now on the cop side of things, you're worried. I mean, it is a crime scene at that point. The event. You're not sure what happened. Now, obviously, everyone knew at the time. If you listen to the what I'll call the Calvert video, Mr. Calvert's video, within 30 seconds of him starting filming, the entire crowd out in front of the Calvert Safe building across the street is talking about how all day they smelled gas. So were you guys aware too that of the gas issue at that point, like being an ongoing problem, or?
We were aware that the gas company had been called a couple times to the area. We did not know what the resolution of those calls were. So at that point in time, it was an assumption, and it was pretty much an informed assumption that there was probably gas involved in this thing. So again, it wasn't a positive thing, but it was something we surmised. And again, from the experiences that we had, we sort of knew that's where it was coming from.
And once you arrived back on scene in, cop mode, like what was your assignment then? What were you handling?
Basically, setting up scene security. We had to make preparations, again, because we surmised there was going to be a lot of people potentially in that building. We had to call the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, and we were actually tasked to set up a morgue in an adjacent parking lot with refrigerated trucks to potentially hold victims. So that was in the works. We also had to bring in our officers, and we brought in officers from other towns to begin setting up traffic patterns so that we could start clearing out the area for more equipment, because there was going to be a need for heavier equipment than what was on scene. So it was traffic, it was site security and safety, and it was work with the Chief Medical Examiner, and basically transporting ambulances in and out of the area. If I remember correctly, approximately 20 people were transported with various injuries, broken bones, contusions, stuff you would expect from a building or an explosion.
And looking back, were we prepared for anything like that?
Yes and no. I'd say we were more prepared than we thought we were, and you never know how prepared you are until you find out how prepared you're not.
Right. I mean, we always joke, right? Mike Tyson's famous quote: "Everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face." And I think that, growing up, I remember us doing a lot of disaster drills.
We would try to do an annual disaster drill with the entire valley, and again, it was we would pick a different town each time. We would notify all the EMS services, all the fire departments, and law enforcement. And the Valley Fire Chief School became the focal point for most of those exercises. And so we were not only involved in responding to those drills, but we were very deeply involved with the Valley Fire School in setting those exercises up. So it basically paved the way for us to be prepared and hope that we never have to be as prepared as we had to that day. But we were able to quickly, I'd say, assess the scene and move people to where they needed to be, hospitals, and wherever else they had to go. So it did work better than we could have anticipated.
Now, again, we have the audio of the incident from CMed, and it's a very terrible quality. But again, if you listen to the audio, it's everybody implementing the disaster plans. It's you calling and asking for it. It's Artie calling and asking for it, and then it's the CMed calling Griffin and letting them know, and it's everybody ramping that beast up, and I think after all these years of listening to that, it does show that there was some level of preparedness, I think, on the mass casualty side. Obviously at that point in the valley, over the past decade, you guys, as the volunteer, the firefighters, you had kind of been beat up. I mean, a decade earlier, you had the B.F. Goodrich explosion. You had Hull Die. You had a lot of these large-scale, massive, fires and incidents, too, that all kind of add up, correct?
Yes. The Valley, unfortunately, had been the center for what at the time was one of the largest arson for hire incidents in the United States. That was the B.F. Goodrich fire. The Hull Die fire basically took out an entire factory. We had latex foam, and we had several major incidents. All pretty much people learned from. And as Dave said, the EMS side of it was mass casualty. The fire side became the best way to put it would be the proving grounds for the incident command system. While it wasn't formalized, it normally would fall into place. Only because the Valley is such a small town, a small area, that when the fire department from Ansonia came, you knew who the chiefs were. You knew who the guys who were in charge were. Shelton came, you knew those chiefs. So as you all came together, you knew who you were dealing with, you knew what resources they could bring to the table, and you knew how you could best utilize them. And as we saw many years later, and as the fire service has progressed, we now have a formalized incident command system that people don't even think twice about anymore. It just falls into place the minute you get on scene.
And how long were you on scene? Do you remember how long were you there?
Personally?
Yeah.
I remember getting home a day and a half later. And that was just being there the entire time until we could start rotating our people out and sending them home for rest. The entire field investigation took approximately 2.5 weeks. And that was dealing with the gas companies, the construction companies in the area, the debris removal teams, and then we had NTSB. I mean, you had the whole alphabet soup of federal agencies that were getting involved with it.
All right. Well, I mean, anything else that you want to?
No. If I, it's a day that I sort of just hope to get through with nothing happening. The time of the year, the holidays, the people you knew, the funerals, the wakes, all of that just seemed to compound into one very scary scenario for the entire valley. We lost a lot of good people and a lot of established families and their members, and so it's something you'll never forget. But at least you were there, and you could offer some sense of saying, "Hey, we tried our best, and this is what we did to help."
Now, after you got home, after that day and a half, I'm sure by then, the mom had it with us. I'm sure the oldest child and the youngest child were terrible, but the middle child was probably an angel for that time too. I was just throwing that out there as a guess.
We all know the middle child, but I can remember when I got home. Actually, Ellen, my wife, had taken you guys out so I could get some sleep. And the first thing I did, I laid down and the phone rang. And it happened to be my mother-in-law. And we had about a 10-minute conversation. And that's something I won't forget because she kind of knew I was shot, I was tired, and she was just really supportive. I was very lucky to have a mother-in-law like her. And she just, kind of put me at ease, just so that I could get to bed and move on with the things that had to be done.
Well, if there was any wife in the Valley that could handle the stress of being a first responder's wife, it would have been my grandmother, right? I mean, after dealing with my grandfather for all those years, for her, that was probably no big deal.
No doubt about that.
All right, so thanks, Dad. It was a great time. I thank you for sharing the story. So next week we're bringing back our first guest, Mike Whittick. Mike was one of the guys that was involved in tunneling down from the top to rescue Mike at Bolito. So we're going to cover that a little bit more. But until next week, stay tuned. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And have a good weekend, everybody.